Hi, Stan.
Hello, hello.
Good morning. How are you?
Very fine, thank you.
Hello.
Hi, Nico.
Hello, Charles, the host. Hello, Stan. I think we can start now, right? So good evening and welcome everyone. Happy Chinese Lantern Festival is today. And this is China GSD's third online lecture in the Talks from Cambridge series, 50 Species Towns. My name is Nico Tian from MDAS Ecologies, and I would also like to introduce our co-moderator Coco Wu from the MLAUD program. So today we are very delighted to have Professor Charles Wildham and Stanislaus Fung forming our lecture and conversation regarding Chinese agricultural modernization. Professor Charles Wildham is John E. Irving Professor at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design, where he directs the school's Office for Urbanization, while his research examines the relationship between landscape, ecology, and contemporary urbanism. Professor Stanislaus Fung is the lecturer in landscape architecture at Harvard GSD and the Junk Associate Professor of Architecture at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. His research extensively focuses on Chinese landscape architecture and architecture in both traditional and contemporary contexts. We appreciate both professors joining us today across continents in different time zones. Welcome, Charles and Stan, and good morning to the audience watching this lecture in China. So our session today will be structured in two parts. First, we will have Professor Charles Wildham introducing his recent research project, 50 Species Towns, and then we will jump into the conversation between two professors and follow with a Q&A session, answering questions emerging from our broad audience. For everyone, whether you are in the Zoom or on the live stream, please leave your questions in the chatting box. We will have a team gathering the questions, and with any concern, if you can also send the questions directly to Coco and me. All right, now let's pass the stage to Professor Charles Wildham. Go ahead, Charles.
Thank you, Nico. Thank you, Coco. Thanks to China GSD for all your hospitality. Happy New Year. Nice to see everyone. Stan, thank you for getting up early for this. Nice to see you. So what we hope to do is really move to a conversation about this this piece of research. The first thing that I want to suggest is that while I'll be doing a lot of the talking, you know, the research project is really the product of a collaboration amongst many people, and so I'm happy to represent and stand for that group. But the first thing to say is this was a project that arose out of our research in the Office for Urbanization. So we are we're a small applied design research group at the GSD. We hire recent graduates of the GSD and other design schools, and we apply the kind of expertise of the GSD toward contemporary cities, let's say. And most often we're advising cities, governments, communities about choices they might face based on the research. We're very pleased to be here with you and to share this book. The book now exists in physical form. It's one of the things that I'm regretting about this format is that by virtue of not being able to hold the book in our hands, we're quite proud about the design of the book, which is a collaboration with Michael Rock and 2x4 graphic designers out of New York who've worked with the office over many years. And it's also a project that we have developed in the office with a core team, and that includes Charlie Gaillard, Mariano Gomez Luque, Mercedes Peralta, Min Yao, and Boya Zheng, among many other collaborators and research assistants. And I want to just give a shout out to the core team. The project has had various iterations, but in essence, the project is really trying to propose an alternative image for agrarian new towns in China. At its base, the goal is to present 50 alternatives to other options available to inform decision-making in China about the agricultural new town. And I'm happy to say a little bit more about that, and I'll share with you, a couple of examples from it. Nico, would it be possible for us to turn off the chime? That would be awesome. Thanks so much. So the project is a design research project that's meant to simultaneously recommend an alternative to the dominant mode of agricultural new town development in China. It's also meant to contribute to the body of literature in our fields about those topics around the world. The project is premised on the idea of the propagation of 50 heritage crops. I'll say more about that in a minute. Each of these species towns will have a kind of mascot, a kind of icon, a celebrity species, if you could think about it that way, as its moniker. And it considered these Chinese crops and their material cultures as a unique and invaluable form of cultural heritage. We'll say a bit more about that, but one of the real challenges in this kind of work is the danger of, as China modernizes its agriculture, as it attempts to bring the rural into the modern economy, there's a great danger of erasing the cultural heritage of this great nation. That's supported with quite a lot of research. We'll say a moment about that. Nico, is there any way we could turn off the chime? The participants coming in and out chime, that would be helpful, at least for me.
Yes, Claude, can you do that?
Maybe not. As long as everyone is joining, I'm happy. So one of the things that's important to this project is the notion of the imaginary, right? So it's our premise in the office that cities are not just the response to technological or economic or demographic changes. They also are reflective of certain, images that we carry, and that the city is really a kind of collective work of imagination. And so we've done quite a lot of work looking at various kind of moments in the development of Chinese agriculture and the kind of agricultural village, and the idea that those were inscribed in various historical eras. Each one of them had their own political economy, each one had their own economic and infrastructural technological issues, and each one was inscribed in a distinct, let's say, form of representation. This is something that's really important to this kind of work for us, that each era in this long tradition, this long story, has had its own imagery, and we're mindful of that, interested in that, but also trying to address real pressing societal and environmental challenges. The motivation behind the project begins with the 13th five-year plan for economic and social development for the People's Republic. This was published in 2016. And so now 6 years later, what we're doing is providing a way to kind of imagine building upon those recommendations, those aspirations. Among the aspirations of that 13th five-year plan include improving the conditions for living and working in the countryside. This is, of course, a massive and urgent project. It has to do with cultivating and developing special economies, characteristic of their local areas, to develop eco-friendly or ecologically informed agricultural practices, to try to move away from fertilizers and pesticides, to promote closer cooperation between agriculture, leisure, tourism, education, culture, and health. This has to do with the integration of the agrarian into the modern economy. In some ways, you might think of, Deng Xiaoping's opening and the notion of this kind of new economy, this new form of capitalism, in which the rural agricultural town has been really the last to be integrated in a way. Their proposal includes also the integration of technology, both information and agricultural production management, various forms of modern, let's say, production techniques, and to complete the mechanization process. So this sounds perhaps contradictory from those of us in the West, but essentially what they're proposing to do is to simultaneously move to scale the mechanical paradigm, something that the US and Canada did in the 20th century, for example, by growing scale, growing certain monocrops, moving to genetically modified seeds, et cetera, but simultaneously moving into the 21st century and trying to also modernize in terms of ecological performance, pesticides, and the like. This, of course, will depend upon dealing with real extreme hydrological conditions, both flood and drought, aridification, desertification, and a series of challenges associated with climate change that will make that increasingly difficult. And then, of course, the necessary infrastructure, both communications, transportation, to enable that new economy, and to enable these county economies to support their own economic development in their surrounding hinterlands. A part of this is meant to obviously take pressure off of the secondary and tertiary cities, to keep people back on the farm, but also to encourage people that have done well in the city to move back to the countryside. And of course, it's addressing the real pressing social conditions in which many Chinese have left the province to move to the city for obvious reasons, for economic development, for a better life, to participate in the new economy. And this leaves a generation back on the farm, many of whom are, between the grandparents and the children, in a way, a kind of, lost generation that are in great need socially, educationally, in terms of public health and the like. Now, our premise in response to that 13-year plan is that many of these are laudable goals. We support, of course, China's desire to feed its population and to do so in a more ecologically sustainable way, to elevate the quality of life and the quality of work in these agricultural villages, and to integrate them more completely to alleviate some of the increasing pressures, the inequity between living in the city and living in the countryside. However, we are critical of this. Our argument is that the encroachment of monoculture crops, that China will overwhelmingly be growing 4 staple crops, right? Rice, wheat, corn, and soy. As they do that, there's a real danger that they erase or severely damage Chinese unique agricultural heritage and culinary culture. We're interested, of course, in who these people might be, who will stay on the farm, but also who might move back. And so we've done here, you can see quite a detailed study about different demographics, different ideas of activities and programs, different conceptions of lifestyle. You might think about this. But the real centerpiece of the project, the real fundamental dimension of it, has to do with what's known in this field as intangible cultural heritage. Now, in the GSD, of course, we spend a lot of time thinking about architecture, tangible cultural heritage. But of course, UNESCO, among other organizations and NGOs, have developed metrics around intangible cultural heritage. And so our work is based on both UNESCO measures, in this regard, some dozens and dozens of intangible cultural heritage that UNESCO recognizes. These are songs, bathing practices, various forms of education, opera, extraordinary range of pictorial arts, traditional calligraphy, paperwork, and the like. And based on also Chinese literature, Chinese institutional knowledge, there is the United Nations GIAH program, China's nationally important agricultural heritage systems. All of these we've built our work upon. And based on that, we've identified what we think of as the 50 most valuable and equally most vulnerable heritage crops. And you can see them here. And this is both the titular concept of the book, it's what the book is named after, but it also provides the kind of substance, the content, the nourishment, let's say, of each of these towns. As China works to modernize, no one wants to live in agricultural Newtown 472B. Right? This is not something that really we want to return to. But in fact, the idea of living in a town which is named for and identified based on a very, very cherished aspect of culinary heritage is the concept here. We're proposing to both maintain that cultural heritage, but also amplify it in certain ways. In this respect, there's an important precedent project for us. This is the work of Dr. Kongjian Yu and his team at Turinscape. Almost 20 years ago now, Kongjian Yu and Turinscape developed the design for the Xinyang University campus. Now, this was an important precedent for us, and it's been really important. This region was, of course, known for its famous Northeast rice. The university campus was planned by planners and architects, and my friend Kongjian tells me that, in fact, they spent all the money on the architecture. So when it came to the landscape for the campus, they had no budget left. And he said, well, what if we were to take the species, this famous rice, that had been effectively erased in the transition from agricultural land to university campus, what if we made that the identity of the campus? And they in fact used this as the primary palette, building a series of pathways and waterways and allays and other landscape devices in which the rice becomes not only the fabric of the landscape, the material, it informs its ecological practices, its seasonal kind of calendar, but it also in fact shapes the identity of the university itself. It becomes an important marker in the calendar of the year with harvest festivals and seeding. It's a product that you can purchase. I think they even named the sports teams after this. So this is the idea. This is the precedent that's informed our work, which is, what if we took this approach and applied it not to a university's identity, but equally to the idea of a new town, an agricultural new town, and its identity. And so based on that, we've proceeded to produce this offering. And don't worry, I don't plan on offering you all 50. Hopefully when we get together again, we can see the book itself, but I thought I would prepare just a short course, 3-course meal, starting with the jujube. Jia County has produced, cultivated, developed the jujube fruit for over 3,000 years. This is an extraordinary cultural tradition. These ancient gardens contain trees over 1,000 years old, with cultivars representing each state in the history of its domestication. The jujube fruit, you may know, has more vitamin C than the orange, more sugar than sugarcane, and yet it grows in these very, very arid conditions. Primarily on the Lost Plateau, these jujube gardens work in these dust-sized deposits of particles, hundreds of meters thick, and these soils consist entirely of wind-borne material from the desert formed in the leeward rain shadow of the Himalayas, among other places. That produces a prevalent regional culture, particularly in Jia County, among other places, in which the jujube is inscribed in its folk traditions, and in which, of course, the idea of the jujube cake feast becomes, cakes and buns and rice dumplings and jams and honey. All of this is built upon the cultural construct. You can see here this cake festival in Jia County. All of this is built upon very specific and precise agricultural techniques, a very precise set of landscape spaces and materials and textures. And we are careful in these studies to try to be mindful of those traditions, but also to inscribe new landscape forms with them. You can see the drying of them and the extraordinary color that's inscribed both in the material itself, but also in the festivals, in the clothing and the activities surrounding it. We're interested here in the growth logic. And in some ways, we would argue that in some ways a city might be a tree or at least a plant. And you can see on the right-hand side of the image here a kind of encyclopedic measure that our friends at 2x4 developed with us. You can see the jujube here with its little icon on the list of 50. The 50 are organized by latitude. And in general, we try to organize our work in the office by latitude and solar orientation, and or by climate zone. We're also interested to note that, of course, the cultivation of the jujube is important to this county, accounting for approximately 80% of the local farmers' average incomes per year. Now, of course, the modernization of this practice and other things will, of course, hopefully increase the overall economic prosperity of the region. Having said that, our argument is to maintain the jujube as a part of the identity of this place going forward. We're also mindful and interested in the particular architectural types and urban types of each of these places. And so we've done here a series of studies scanning the kind of village fabric, block structure, and courtyard type. In this case, the skinny courtyard is a primary major residence type in Guangzhou. And ultimately, we're interested to study, in this case, the range, the depth, the height, and the width of the kind of population of these different structures. And that structure also helps us informs our thinking about block structure, building height, and the kind. You can see here on the right our own kind of typological matrix. From that, we develop a very specific kind of town plan organized around the principles of the species in question. And then we adapt that to the very particular hydrology, topography, soils, etc., ultimately pulling in to try to understand what that might be like as a kind of urban morphology, and then pulling back ultimately to see how that might be situated in the context of the territory. That work is supported by a collaboration that we've had with Andrew Witt of the Harvard GSD and his research group. Between Andrew Witt and his firm Certain Measures and his research group and the Office for Urbanization, we've developed a kind of reading into typology that we found quite interesting. Traditionally, if you look at the urban pattern or urban form of the agricultural village in China, it's traditionally been described in the literature as organized in 3 ways based on latitude. Northern spatial types tend to be described as clustered. Those in the center tend to be described as linear growth patterns. And then those in the south tend to be spotted. And that's a more or less direct translation. And it does hold up upon inspection. In looking at dozens of cases of actual villages, that morphology tends to be true. The literature tends to overstate and group them in a way, whereas there's more overlap between the regions. Having said that, we took that knowledge, as well as our own Office for Urbanization kind of climate response here, looking at climate zone, proportion of block structure based on thermal response of latitude, solar orientation of the block structure, land and buildable area, then looking at the ways in which that might be structured to shape the notion of our new town. The book is then interspersed with a series of photographic portfolios. These are photographic portfolios that are meant to give us something of the flavor of being on the ground, because with this work we can be at quite a distance from the ground. And so I'll share just briefly as a kind of transition from one course to the second. This is the work of Xiaoxiao Zhu, a photographer who's been doing quite a lot of work in various parts of China and does really extraordinary work in Gansu, in Hebei, Shaanxi, documenting the kind of living conditions, the material conditions, what it's like to live as a farmer in parts of China. And for me, these images give us a sense of proximity, a kind of empathy in a way, and they ground the project in a way to make sure that we don't get too far away from the subject matter at hand. Second course is rapeseed. The rapeseed thrives in the Köppen-Geiger climate zone DWA, continental winter dry. That means primarily in the central latitudes, 25 to 58 north. It's primarily associated with the production of canola oil and a variety of other practices. It can be used to remediate metal pollutions in soils. It can be used to produce plant-based fertilizers. It can reduce carcinogenic compounds in foods. Refining it makes it one of the most important oils available, accounting for something like almost half of all vegetable oil production in China. The practice of cultivating rapeseed, of course, has its own history and tradition. This is, again, a part of the cultural heritage that we're trying to get at. I would love to know, tell you more about the backstory of this particular photo, for example. But what's maybe most interesting in this space is the idea of the traditional practice of the raised field agriculture, in which this kind of agroecological system developed over thousands of years combines, these artificial islands, the growing of the rapeseed with fish farming, right? This hybrid aquatic terrestrial landscape, this is relatively rare today, but is again another aspect of this important millennia of Chinese culinary heritage. On the islands in Jiutian, the rapeseed grows alongside wheat, bean, millet, and other associated crops. And this combination of biotic agents means that the system requires very little input in terms of other fertilizers or amendments, right? In that regard, the topography of this system has also been managed in a very particular way. And again, we're interested in this case, the roasted version, the color, the texture, the materiality, as well as the spatial condition in which the rapeseed might be understood to grow, its own growth logic, and equally the particular kind of morphology of the village. In this case, the Huzu dwelling, the kind of skywell, central skywell housing type, which has been quite well described in the literature. We appropriate that to inform our own block structure and our own courtyard strategy. A growth logic emerges from the logic of the rapeseed. And again, a new town sprouts in the context of a particular regional territory. Now, the work on typology, as I mentioned, supported by the collaboration with Andrew Witt, is something that we've been interested to do for some time, and we think has other potential applications, both in China, but also elsewhere. If you study the literature on the Chinese agricultural village, you'll find that from the 1980s on in English, but certainly also in translation from the Mandarin, there are quite clear documentation about typology or type of village structure, block structure, and house structure. And those typological accounts are well documented. They're quite widely available in the Harvard Library collections. And so we have identified 18 of those across China that seem quite important. And our critique there is that this is important literature, but the approach to type, similar to the approach to type in the history of the GSD or in European studies of architecture, tends to overstate the notion of the ideal body. Typology tends to identify, you can see here this plan of the Guansong skinny courtyard at the top here. That is kind of an idealized type. Think of, the Michelangelo's drawings, or think of, the Vitruvian Man, this idea of the ideal body. And we're interested, Andrew Witt and I, in the idea that we can scan entire populations now. So we can scan dozens and dozens or hundreds of examples of these. And we can see here an entire population on the bottom in this matrix. What are the widths and thicknesses? Because actual bodies are far more interesting than ideal bodies for me personally. And the width and the height provides a kind of sampling, a kind of demographic approach, a kind of population approach, let's say. It's a little bit like a shift from medicine on the perfect body to public health on an entire population. You can see that contrast here, where clearly the skinny courtyard appears and is legible and identifiable, but ultimately the range of what constitutes a skinny courtyard house and how wide and how narrow and what the various permutations might be, that becomes the interest here. We can look at it in terms of its orientation north-south. This is the Huzhou Skywell, the second type that I've shown you. And we can see that while it's more closely aligned with this square pattern, some of them are relatively small, some get quite large. And so that the ability to use kind of digital workflows to scan these from satellite photographs has become an important part of our workflow. And then you can see here on the left, again, the Huzhou Skywell, the kind of X-ray of hundreds of those examples to give us a kind of an image of the range of possibility, as opposed to the typical plan, which is reproduced in the literature from the 20th century, which gets at a kind of idealized form. Similarly here, the Fujian Tulu, the kind of circular form, which has its own extraordinary cultural heritage. Again, that X-ray looking at the range of typologies, the limits, much more kind of stable, we found, much more consistent. And then, of course, again, another kind of attempt to try to document all of this. We try to show in the back of the book, in the coda section, in these pink pages, all of our homework, as it were. The next photographic portfolio before we move to the final course is the work of Tul and Bruno Morandi. They've been doing work in various parts of China documenting kind of village life, and they've got this portfolio of work of Chengdu and Sichuan province, which is hovering around the notion of the pepper and the pepper festival, and the kind of the success story in this case, as it were, of the idea of added value. Of course, in this case, the tea house and the notion of tea cultivation of landscape, and a kind of tea terroir, to use that analogy. And then finally, the Tianjin pepper to kind of round out the menu. Now we have Mao in English translation suggesting that the food of the true revolutionary is the red pepper, and that one that cannot endure the red pepper is unable to fight. I can't speak to that. We have it on good authority that this was said at some point, but ultimately I don't want to make any great claims about that. The Tianjin pepper is, of course, subtropical, humid CFA, Köppen-Geiger climate zone. It works in the southern latitudes. It's native not to China, but to South America, Bolivia, Paraguay. The pepper was introduced to China in the late Ming Dynasty in the 14th, 15th century. They tend to grow into areas of a certain shale soil, heavy texture, calcium, and some of the oldest places of red pepper cultivation, such as Jintian County, peppers are harvested by hand, and they've gone through hundreds and hundreds of years of breeding, developing varietals, fragrance, sweetness, spiciness, and the like. And I suppose you may know something more about that than I do. You can see here the coloration. This is something that's very particular to culinary culture, that there's something about the fact that we inhale these things, we ingest them, we live with them, and their coloration becomes a non-trivial aspect of the cultural heritage in these regions. And the idea of our proximity to these plants, the kind of the intimacy of plant material, the fact that it has a biologic kind of metabolic effect on us, that it changes our heart rate, it changes our perspiration, changes our frame of mind and our blood sugar and our attitude. All of these things are, of course, interesting across the range of the 50. When introduced originally, of course, the Tianjin pepper was not food, but it was primarily for medicinal or ornamental uses. And they became integrated ultimately into Chinese cuisine, becoming ultimately one of the kind of signature kind of spices, let's say. In this case, the idea of that variety and maintaining that variety becomes important. The local varietal cultivated in Taoling Town, Xinjiang County, Hunan Province, is known for a unique 3-flavor profile and has been nationally awarded on a variety of scales, right? In this case, we can talk about Scoville heat units, we can talk about botanical themes, we can talk about the flowering of the plant itself. We've touched on the coloration, but it's also the kind of agricultural terrace and the kind of space in which this thing is cultivated that's interesting to us here. In this context, the Hunan Big House, a type of communal residence, central South China, is interesting and is almost defying typological coherence, is what we can find. There's more to be said about that, and maybe an interesting conversation there. The skywells in those structures work not only to function as a means of ventilation, they also represent a kind of social structure in a way. And we've developed that based on the kind of fishbone structure. And from the pepper, we developed these grid-like blocks, placing that again into this typological array of different building types and densities, with the idea that those can be interspersed, a kind of mosaic of orchards and parks and farms. Ultimately, the goal of this work is it's a set of critical explorations. It's meant to be kind of opening up an approach to thinking about the shape of the agricultural new town and developing a unique methodology that might be applicable or relevant in China, but also elsewhere. And I'm just so glad to be here and to have you all receive the book on its maiden voyage. And Nika, Coco, really enjoy your hospitality. Thanks so very much, and we'll look forward to a conversation.
Thank you, Charles. I think we can start in between you and Stan right now, because we are still collecting the questions, and then we can jump into student questions.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation and for the book. I have the Chinese version here, if you were able to see it. It's a huge book, and I appreciate very much the diversity of work that is in it. One question I have on my mind as I went through the book was that in between very different kinds of information and images, it leaves a lot of space for different kinds of readers to think with the information and the images that are presented. So I was wondering whether you would like to say something about the diversity of images and how you envisage different kinds of people might interact with these images, especially the differences of scales involved in the images. I gather that some images are really documentary and they're tied and pegged to data sets. And there are other kinds of images that are really opening the gap between working drawing and the imaginal, and they are really imaginings and settings for urban kind of agglomerations. They're not very. There's some scalar specificity to it, but not entirely tied down. So I was just wondering, as the first question, whether you would like to say something about that.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks, Stan. I appreciate that. I think there are at least two kind of interesting layers to that observation, and thanks for it. So the first is the variety of material is something that I have thought a lot about over a longer period of time in other projects as well. I've been interested for a long time in the the work of an anthropologist, ethnographer called Clifford Geertz. And Clifford Geertz, you know, in the postmodern era, was really concerned about his inability to go in and describe a condition, a found condition, without intervening, or to do so from a point of view of authority. And he developed this concept of thick description. And thick description proposes that, well, we can never be neutral. Just by showing up, we're going to alter the conditions. But we might be able to acknowledge that by having different lenses of description. And rather than thinking about it as a unified whole, the idea of these different lenses or different layers of description produce a kind of thickness. And the thickness is not meant to be, you know, totalizing or hermetic. It's not meant to be closed, but the thickening is meant to give us multiple entry points, which really, you know, is also implied in your question, which is about how people are meant to, you know, encounter this book. And so it's written, you know, primarily for two audiences that are radically different, right? It's written on the one hand for the audiences in China and in East Asia, for whom this might provide an alternative image, might provide a moment of pause or reflection. And for those audiences, these are, you know, land developers and planners and architects and advocates for cultural heritage and environmental advocates and people looking to, you know, resist modernization in various forms. And for those audiences, the idea is, I'd hope, would be that we're seen to be taking that cultural heritage quite seriously because it's coming from Chinese material and we're simply presenting it back. On the other hand, we're hopeful that the book will also contribute to the recent conversation around the countryside or around the new agrarian or around, you know, agricultural modernization that's happening in the rest of the world and might be relevant for design audiences. So for those two audiences, I would imagine that they will see the book quite differently. It does exist in Mandarin and English, as you've mentioned, Stan. And so in that regard, we will see, as we will with all projects, who reads it and what they find in it. One always is a little bit open-minded about that. And the last thing I'll say is, to your point about openness, our goal at least is for it to be kind of generous, you know, generative, opening. We try to be quite clear about our methodology and our approach, cite our sources, know our facts, to be well read in the literature in these areas in both Mandarin and English, of course, but ultimately to propose a way of thinking about urbanization, which might be, if not progressive, at least something that we could think positively about going forward.
The kinds of literature that I've been working with on the gardens, that they sometimes show up with the names of plants, and some of these plants are featured in your book. So I can imagine a conversation later on we can have separately about the historical literature that discusses these plants in settings for daily life, where the cultural expression of the plants are given prominence in certain kinds of spatialized descriptions of places. Normally in Chinese literature, the discussion of plants and the description of the plants and their cultivation forms one body of text, and then the discussions about the specific cultural landscapes and gardens, they are in a separate body, and the kinds of people studying these texts, they're in different groups, and the literature is very rarely correlated. But one thing that I noticed when I went through your book is how there is now an opportunity to open the field of historical reference to the contemporary settings in these places. And some of these places that you call attention to have a historical, longer time span involvement with the plants. So there's this possibility, I think, for other conversations to correlate different bodies of material together.
I'm sure, I mean, from your knowledge of, you know, medicinal gardens, kitchen gardens, ornamental gardens, you know, there's a very kind of interesting kind of spillover between those things. And one of the things that I was so heartened by when we started this project a couple of years ago was just the deep Chinese knowledge. I mean, that these are things that, of course, have been studied. It's relatively easy for us to identify, well, these are of great cultural value because they've been, just for example, we have this epigraph quote. I made this reference to the Mao Zedong fighting thing, but really just the poetic tradition, the numbers of poems written about various foodstuffs, they're limitless.
Yes, the literature that I study call attention to implicit horizons, horizons of understanding, interpretations, and so on. So just a moment ago, when you were mentioning the thick descriptions, I was reminded of Clifford Geertz's idea that the local informants will tell us things explicitly. And the thick description consists of these things that are said to us explicitly. But in all cultures, whenever cultures differ from each other, the assumptions that are implicit make a lot of leeway in terms of how cultures are different. So one of the things that I think we can do in the future is to see in between our different sets of material, how the explicit and implicit horizons of understanding might be correlated in useful ways. I'm conscious that I shouldn't take over the entire question and answer time, and we should leave some opportunity for the other parts of the audience. Thank you very much for this opportunity to see the book.
Thank you. Yeah. It's lovely to see you and spend some time with you. And thank you for your attention to the book. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Charles, for your great lecture and your great book. We have an audience like really ready to buy one and ask whether there's a discount for buying one. Yeah, and we have collected several questions. And the first is like, are there agricultural towns economically connected in a regional or domestic scale for the species towns you're studying in?
If I understand the question, yeah, it's about kind of regional and economic connectivity. I think this is one of the first questions that we had, when we began looking at this years ago. We saw the 13th five-year plan, and we saw the dilemma, the challenges that the party were addressing, but also the difficulty. That was one of our first questions was, well, who would live here? This has always been, I think, one of the challenges around the idea of a new town is, I mean, if the town hasn't been there yet, then who's going to move there and why? And, will they do so of their own volition? Will they be, will they be in a situation where it seemed to be desirable or not? So we took the kind of development program that many of the large land development companies had been working on in the, in the wake of the 2016 five-year plan, in which they were identifying, sites that were, if not greenfield, at least could take the pressure off of and advocate for preservation of existing, existing agricultural towns, existing villages. That's been another subtext of the project, is the importance of maintaining the village fabric, as it's valuable, and then building, accommodation for, in this case, something like 50,000 people, relatively small towns in the Chinese context. Of course, they need to be, economically and infrastructurally connected. And what we've done is we've taken this approach that, as opposed to locating these towns based on land value or ownership, or instead of locating them based on access to transportation, we tried this process of identifying the ideal location from the species point of view. Now, that's admittedly an indulgence that we have, because we have the luxury of thinking from the plant out. It's admittedly maybe not the way that the world would get built ultimately, but the goal there was to think through this organization of this town, but also its location, that is, which climate zone, which soil, which topographic, which solar orientation, so that these things are relatively precisely located, but not from the logic of economy, not from the logic of transportation, but rather from the logic of the plant's own reproductive desires, let's say. Now, that's admittedly a very, it's a very indulgent way to think about this. But in that sense, we prioritized the plant and the cultivation of that culture, and then tried to do as little damage as possible to the existing agricultural life and village life that we found there.
Yeah, Thank you so much. And we have our audience like really interested about the dynamic diagram that drawn in the books, like for the with the lines. And he's really interested about how do this town structure or typology link with the species that is growing in the town. Charles,
Thanks for that. Yeah, one of the things that I've been mindful of for some time, of course, is a long-standing debate in our field in the urban arts about the shape of the city, right? So it's a fundamental question of architects, urban designers, urban planners, and there's something about that transcends even Chinese history. It's a human condition, that where does the shape of the city come from? Now, of course, our point of view is that it doesn't simply come from economics or engineering. It's not simply an informal, autonomous self-organization, but in fact, the city might be a work of design. And from that point of view, we're engaging in a kind of debate with Christopher Alexander, who famously argued, of course, that a city is not a tree. There's been a longstanding critique of the idea of the city emulating the natural world. And to that, my response has been, well, why couldn't it be? That is, on the one hand, I'm committed to the idea of the city as a work of intention. And in that regard, it's not as though necessarily any one of these should be built precisely to this plan, but rather it gives us a kind of framework. In that framework, what we've tried to do is isolate and understand the growth logic of the species. And so that at every decision at the scale of the city, whether it's about the location of the town, the shape of the town, its relationship to the sun, is it on the sunny side of the hill or the dark side of the hill? Is it wet? Is it dry? All the way down to the scale of the block, we tried to ask, what would the jujube want? And that's admittedly a perverse way of operating, but there's a certain clarity for that in our work, we hope, which is in its extremity, it reveals a condition, right? So those growth logic diagrams were really about the morphology of the plant itself. And I do believe that there are moments in which we can make value judgments about the design of a city, the shape of the city, and we can apply various logics. And this is a logic which prioritizes the expression of the plant in its color scheme and its naming, but ultimately also in the shape of the city itself. Not because there aren't other factors or other criteria, but rather because, in fact, we know that the shape has to be derived from somewhere. And for a long time, we've developed either economic models or simple gridirons or other devices. Not that those aren't useful, but I think of this as a more specific and perhaps more genuine approach, let's say.
Thanks, Charles. I think I will ask one more question, and maybe Yixin has the last one, and we can finish the conversation. So I really appreciate your insight in forming this new type of agrarian village development model and respecting either the cultural, agricultural production heritage, and especially when you mentioned the culinary uniqueness in different regions in China. I think that's very impressive to me. And from our discussion, I think you've mentioned the capital flow and also the new type of land development. So my question is, in China, we have various types of heritage in different production that includes different types of industries, and also throughout the time, I think there is a emotional narrative that embedded from the historical formation in different regions. And how would you envision this future type of urbanization that would transform, I would say, gradually shift the flow of current labor and also the demographics composition towards this, like the existing urban conditions. So I'm asking this because knowing this demographic difference, this different pattern, they're dramatically different in different regions in China because it's so big. And so I feel like there is a big potential in changing this narrative.
Thank you, Nico. It's a great question, and it's something obviously we spent a lot of time thinking about. I mean, to your first point, it's I believe it to be true that almost every culture that I'm aware of, even as much as its language or its architectural culture or its religious beliefs, there's nothing more fundamental than food culture, in a way. And that's one of the one of the ideas that we posit with the project is that who am I from the Harvard GSD to say something about the the Chinese city? I mean, on the other hand, all I have to do is read the literature and think about, well, the meaning of these crops because of their deep historical resonance and the meaning that's built from them. And it's a meaning which is not just distant history. It's not just in the museum. It's genuinely lived, right? I mean, it's something that you reproduce all the time, right? So in that sense, that's one of the things that gave me hope coming as an outsider to this problem, let's say, that I thought I might be able to offer something, because I know that there's nothing more personal than food memories. There's nothing more, in a way, painful than being far away and in COVID and not being able to get that food or have that celebration, right? So there's something I think is both universal about that we all share, but which is also deeply, deeply Chinese. Now, the place, that I think about that mostly is, on the one hand, I have a kind of empathy or an understanding for the enormous challenges, that China is facing. I think, as I've said, in other contexts, I think I have of course, we have to acknowledge human rights abuses, environmental degradation, the very, very top-down political economy. It's a very different culture than the culture of the West. Having said that, I think that the challenges, many of them, that the party leadership are trying to address through their program, are genuine challenges. And I think that they are real and human and deserve to be addressed, but they come at also a great danger. The danger being the displacement, the erasure, both of culinary experience, but also of village life, living back on the farm. So to your other point about economic incentive and demographic, I think that's one of the biggest challenges, frankly. In the modernization of Chinese economy and the move to the major cities and then the secondary and tertiary cities, of course, that's been, on the one hand, economically a success, but it has reproduced these incredible economic inequities, these great social tensions between the wealth and the poverty, and frankly, the living conditions, the poverty, the lack of education, the lack of healthcare back on the farm is also a deep, deep, deep challenge, right? So in that regard, I think one aspect of this that I would be sympathetic to is the notion that we have to really just improve the conditions, both economically, infrastructurally, and in terms of public health, for life there. There's also a generation now already of people who have done well, let's say, in the city, or live in the city, or maybe can retire or spent some time in both places, who are going back to village life from the point of view of its experience, right? I mean, my friend Kong Jianyu has this kind of agricultural village that he's been developing, and it's, on the one hand, supporting a new economy. It's a kind of touristic economy. It may be a kind of leisure or luxury economy. Often that can be associated with the development of wine culture or tea or other things, right? So a part of this is a certain lifestyle for people that have done well, but it's also connecting that economy and its products to regional and national, both tourism and value-added products. I think that's clear from what the party's goal in 2016. And I think generally speaking, those are interesting ways of approaching it. But I think what we're trying to stress here is the real danger of erasing, the thing that we got wrong in the 20th century United States, frankly, in going to monoculture crops, genetically modified crops, the environmental contamination of that, but also the pesticide and nitrogen pollution. Ultimately, we erased our own cultural heritage in vast sections of the United States, and that's not something that I want the Chinese to repeat if possible.
Thank you, Charles. I think, yes, there is a potential in all those economy you mentioned, and also I think technically for professional education, also that's one potential. Okay, I will pass it to Yixing.
Yeah, and our audience also have a question about the investigation itself. Like he asked whether you can elaborate further on the conceptual framework of this generative exploration, and what is the possibility of positionality of exploring in this transnational and transcultural entanglement with different knowledge system, value system, political and economic frameworks, and also how do you choose this 50 species for your book and your project?
Thanks, Yushin. That's a lot of questions. It's nice to have a lot of questions at the end. That's good, thank you. The first thing to say is, you know, again, a little bit our approach. My own value system personally is, I think of the Enlightenment as an incomplete project, and by that I mean, you know, with modernization, you know, I believe that, you know, we can achieve great things. Of course, it comes at a cost, and by that I mean, you know, education, science, transfer of knowledge, sharing knowledge across culture, studying each other's languages, being able to have conversations, like having universities like our employer, etc., you know, in which, you know, the goal is the production of knowledge and the sharing of knowledge globally, right? So in that regard, you know, the Enlightenment project has had its problems, right? The Enlightenment project has been associated with colonialism, erasure of local culture, imperialism. It's been associated with the export of a certain kind of knowledge and the erasure of local knowledge. And there are challenges there, I have no doubt. But for me and where I come from, my intellectual formation, I do believe that we can improve conditions in the world by sharing information. And that starts with having conversations like this. And so from that point of view, rather than approaching this question from a contextual point of view, think about context, the literature that we find in China on these topics tends to be quite available, but it does tend to reinforce certain regional, what I'll call stereotypes. A stereotype may be a little strong, and so I'm happy to back off of that. But there tends to be a generalization of, well, there's the North, there's the center, there's the South, there's this and there's that. And what we're trying to do with the building type study is to say, well, yes, this was the lived experience, but maybe there's a finer grain to that. So in addition to the Northern, Central, and Southern, which has been inscribed in policy, it's been historically viewed, we acknowledge that. We're proposing a latitudinal approach, which looks at solar orientation across a latitude and a specific climate zone approach. And that's something that's, you know, it's a model or a paradigm that comes from the West, right? It comes from Germany, Kopp and Geiger, it comes from the study of climate zones. And so in the office, we've developed a series of workflows which tend to be quite modernist in a way. They seem to be quite scientific or technical, but our goal in applying them is to not repeat the problems of the 20th century. So when we look at a climate zone, we look at soil, we look at topography, we're interested in a kind of rule-based approach, a parameter-based approach. And to that, we're mindful of the fact that, you know, the history has been written in a certain way, but we're trying to provide another parameter-based approach that can allow us to both produce a new spatial alternative, but one which is based in something that's that has substance behind it, right? And so in that regard, these spatial diagrams, they are, you know, what's become, you know, associated with the parametric, right? But I think the concept of the parametric has been kind of tarnished because of its use for formal, you know, extravaganza by architects. In this case, my goal in the office is to derive urban form that's more ecologically responsive, more responsive to solar performance, and to apply the knowledge that we do have, even though the 20th century brought with it a series of challenges about this knowledge and its application in a modernist technological way has been problematic. The idea of organizing a town from its thermal response, its climatological response, in service of its cultural heritage, that's our goal with those studies.
Thank you, Charles Wildham. I think that's very helpful for us. And luckily, we still have a lot of questions, but we will try to end here and probably we'll gather in one email and send it to you and get answered. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Charles, for sharing this
Thank you.
more than agriculture.
Let's look forward to round 2, where Stan leads with the garden and I respond. Okay. And we talk about the, you know, the difference between the garden and the farm.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Also, thank you, Stan, for it has been a
It's a
great
pleasure.
conversation. Okay, I think
Thanks,
we'll
Stan.
end here and have a great evening, everyone. See you all.
Thanks,
元宵节
Nico.
快乐.
Thanks,
Bye.
Yishin. Thanks, Coco.
Thank you so much.
Stay well.
Great to see you.
Bye.